welcome everyone to this meeting. Apologies, we've had some technical issues that have caused a slight delay in the start. But I'd like to first just hand over to Kai Schmidt, who will introduce and lead off with his presentation. Over to you, Kai. No.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yeah.
I've got Kerry on the phone who's having some of the difficulties connecting. I'm going to attempt to put her on speakerphone and see whether that works or not. Go ahead, Kerry.
There's a lot of noise.
Kai, can you try again to see if, I think we can't, unfortunately we can't do it over speakerphone because we get a lot of feedback.
Maybe just do this. So, okay, can you hear me now?
Yeah, yeah.
Okay. Sorry everyone for the complications. I think at least I'm on voice now. I'm not sure I'm on video. I'm taking over for Kerry, so I have actually not really prepared any welcome notes, but let's maybe jump over them, given that we have spent some time in connecting. And let me actually move on to our first speaker for this event. Thelma Krug, who is a vice chair of IPCC. She's going to provide us with the latest on the science relating to CDR and getting to in its role in getting to net zero and beyond. With this, then I would like to hand over to Thelma, whom we also managed to connect last minute, so I hope it works. Over to Thelma Krug.
Yes, I'm here, Kai. Can you see me okay? Yes?
Yes.
Well, unfortunately, I'm not being able to share my my slides. But anyway, let's not delay this process. And so my presentation, which is very short, will be in C2G's event page, so everyone can access it. But it doesn't compromise my talk. So let me first say hello to everybody. Good morning, everybody. It has been quite a challenge to be here today. So anyway, but it will work. So I thank the organizers for the invitation for me to be here today. So what I want to talk about is a little bit on the advances that have been made now with the release of the working group one contribution to the IPCC 6 assessment cycle that was released last August. It provides scientific advances since the last assessment report, the fifth one that was released in 2014. So there is one slide that I wanted to show that highlights the main chapters and subsections that address CDR in addition to the technical summary. So if you could see that, you're going to see that you have numerous sections addressing CDR in the many components of CDR, right, including the time-dependent behavior of CO2 fluxes in scenarios with CDR, the effectiveness of CDR in drawing down atmospheric CO2 and cooling global mean temperature, and the symmetry of the climate carbon cycle response to positive and negative CO2 emissions. So it's very unfortunate that we cannot see that. So, and obviously I would not be able to address all those elements anyway, but I think it is interesting for those that want to know more about CDR. You're gonna find a huge amount of information over there, huge advances. So I normally like to start my presentations providing definitions, not exhaustively. But yesterday we had a communication side event, and it became very clear from interviews that people sometimes do not understand the terms or do not have the clear definition, because sometimes it changes also from where you're assessing the definition. So the definition that IPCC provides, which I think it's very general, refers to the anthropogenic activities that seek to remove CO2 from the atmosphere and durably store it in geological, terrestrial, or ocean reservoirs, or also in products, right? So, and does this through different processes. Like the CDR methods are normally categorized by the carbon cycle processes that remove the CO2 from the atmosphere. It includes basically 4 types of processes. The first one being the enhanced net biological production and the storage by land ecosystems. And by that we mean the forest-based methods like afforestation, reforestation, forest management, and also bioenergy with CO2 capture and storage. A second process is similar to land, but it refers to oceans. So it's the enhanced net biological production and the storage in the open and coastal ocean. And here we are talking about ocean fertilization, artificial ocean upwelling. A third process is enhanced geochemical processes on land and ocean. And here we included the enhanced weathering, ocean alkalinization, and finally the direct air capture and storage by chemical processes. So the slide that I would show now would highlight the subsections in the Working Group 1 report that really shows the effects of these specific CDR methods on biogeochemical cycles. And they are presented at length, for instance, forest-based methods like afforestation, reforestation, the role of forest management, ocean alkalinization, ocean fertilization. So there is a profound discussion, let's say, from the assessment that IPCC has made from all the many scientific publications it assessed. So there is also a good summary that is presented in one of the tables that unfortunately I would not be able to show because the report is still subject to final edits. So it is still not completely available. But there, when it is, if you are interested, there is a table 5.9 in chapter 5 that includes for each one of the methods that I described previously in the processes. It provides for each method the nature of CO2 removal process, the time scale of carbon storage, the factors that affect that carbon storage time scale, and termination effects, if any. So that's basically like some of the highlights in the Working Group 1 contribution to the 6 assessment cycle. So, but I want to focus on the scientific knowledge that we have since the Working Group 1 report in 2013. As I mentioned, several advances. I would not be able to go over this, but I think I would like to highlight one specific issue that I'm going to address now. So at the time of the AR5 in 2013, there were very few studies about the global carbon cycle response to CDR. But based on those studies and the general understanding of the carbon cycle, the AR5 assessed that it was virtually certain that the deliberate removal of CO2 from the atmosphere would be partially offset by outgassing of CO2 from ocean and land carbon sinks. So low confidence was placed at that time on the quantification of the effects. So the new report advances on that understanding. And I want to elaborate briefly on the effect of CDR on the land and ocean carbon sinks. So during the industrial era, CO2 emitted by combustion of fossil fuels and land use change was distributed between the atmosphere, the land, and the ocean carbon reservoirs. And that is due to the carbon cycle processes. Over the past decade, so you're talking 2010, 2019, 46% of the CO2 remained in the atmosphere. 23% was taken up by the ocean and 31% by the terrestrial biosphere. So when carbon dioxide removal is applied during periods in which human activities are net CO2 sources to the atmosphere, and the amount of emissions removed by CDR is smaller than the net source, so we have a net positive CO2 emissions, the CDR acts to reduce the net emissions. And in this scenario, part of the CO2 emissions into the atmosphere is removed by the land and the ocean, as has been the case historically. However, when CDR removes more CO2 emissions than human activities emit, and then you have the net negative CO2 emissions that everybody talks about, and also atmospheric CO2 declines, the land and ocean sinks initially continue to take up CO2 from the atmosphere. And this is because carbon sinks, particularly the ocean, exhibits inertia and continues to respond to the prior trajectory of rising atmospheric CO2 concentration. But after some time, which is determined by the magnitude of the removal and the rate and amount of CO2 emissions prior to the CDR application, land and ocean carbon reservoirs begin to release CO2 to the atmosphere, making CDR less effective. But due to the limited agreement between the models, there is still low confidence in the timing of the sink to source transition, and also on the magnitude of the CO2 source in scenarios with net negative CO2 emissions. So this highlights only some of the complexities that we still have regarding the CDR. And obviously, as IPCC normally do, it indicates key research developments that are needed. And primarily it focuses on two of them, which I mentioned. So these are open key research needs. One is to improve the understanding of the effectiveness of CDR methods to lower atmospheric CO2 and reduced warming, taking into account Earth systems feedbacks. And the other one is run large-scale and long-term experiments and assessments to explore regional feasibility of CDR methods, that they present an actual and verifiable negative regional carbon balance, and that they do not result in adverse unintended consequences. So we see that still nothing is clear, crystal clear, as we say. We still have some developments to do, huge improvements, but we have to take into account several other aspects that that we cannot just leave behind when thinking about the contribution of CDR methods. So with that, I hope this brings some contribution for discussion, and I thank you very much.
Thank you, Thelma. Thelma, for your as usual, very interesting presentation on the science and where the science stands and where we are going to head. I see Carrie has joined again, at least by video. Not so sure whether she is able to take over. Carrie, can you? I'm happy to continue to maybe the maître de cérémonie, but as you have prepared for that, you might maybe just want to take over again.
Hi, I'm really hoping that you can hear me now.
Yes, we do.
Yeah, I'm getting some thumbs up. Wonderful. Thank you so much, everybody. And I really realize. Okay, there seems to be an issue on the microphone, so I hope that you can all hear me now. Thank you very much. And I just caught the very end of that, Thelma. That was wonderful. And I would like to pass on now to our next speaker, since I'm aware that I have already caused a delay with my technical issues. And I'd like to pass the microphone over to Eva Halland, who is Project Director for CCS and CO2 offshore storage in Norway from the Norwegian Petroleum Directorate. Eva, the floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you. There's something wrong with the microphone here.
Okay, maybe we should reorder the program, Eva, and ask you to find a headset, if that's possible.
Yeah. Will this, do you hear me now?
Yes, but you have a terrible echo.
Yeah. Will this work? No, it's this one.
Okay. Okay, I suggest we move to presenter Claire Bison, or Matthias Honeger, who is here to speak on the role of governance to ensure sustainability. Or is your microphone working now, Eva?
Yeah.
That's much better.
Can you hear me?
Yes, that's much better. Thank you, Eva.
Yeah, but then I should try to.
Yes, please, if you can give us your presentation.
Yeah. Can you see it? No. Here's something, absolutely something wrong. No.
Okay, in that case, I think while we resolve the next set of technical difficulties, I see that we have Matthias here. Matthias, is your technology playing ball? Are you ready to present?
Yeah. Okay.
Matthias, we can't hear you.
Carrie, we do have Claire.
Well,
we do have.
Yeah, actually, Claire is taking the speaking slot. I'm just the backup.
Okay, all right, Claire, I'm sorry, I couldn't see you there. Could you please give your presentation on the role of governance to ensure sustainability?
Yeah, great. Thank you. So I have an easier job because I'm actually in the studio and people are sorting out the technical issues for me, so very happy to be here. So I'm going to be talking about governance challenges for large-scale carbon dioxide removal, really in the context of the Paris Agreement and the UNFCCC framework, so really international governance levels. And I have a clicker here. So some important context to start off with. The amount of carbon removal that we need to keep to the Paris Agreement warming limit of 1.5, it really depends on what we do in the near term, the stringency of our emissions reductions over the near term. We know that we need some level of carbon dioxide removal. That's to make up for insufficient action to date. So we've been too slow in reducing our emissions so far, and also to compensate for any residual emissions that are very difficult to mitigate once we try and get towards net zero. But that the scale that we ultimately need will depend on what we do in the near term, and you can see that on this graph here. So moving out to the right on the graph, we have more emissions in 2030, out to that orange band, which is roughly where we're heading for under the current set of targets. And then moving upwards on the graph, you get more carbon removal in the system over the century. And there are 4 points shown, which are different example pathways from the IPCC. That red one is a pathway that's not consistent with the Paris Agreement. It overshoots 1.5, heads to 1.8 degrees. And you can see even that has lower emissions in 2030 than where we're currently heading. And that ends up with a very, very large amount of carbon dioxide removal over the century, so likely an unsustainable level of carbon removal. And where we really want to be is over to the left-hand side, to the blue band, and that's halving our emissions by 2030 in those kind of blue dot areas. So clearly we have some work to do, first and foremost, to reduce our emissions in the next decade. So once we've done that, we still will need some carbon dioxide removal, and what we looked at in this paper that came out earlier this year was what governance gaps we will need to address. And really it's quite a lot of questions and some ideas for what we need to start thinking about in the international governance system. So I'll briefly go through a few of these. We don't have a lot of time. But first of all, some political governance challenges. So the really key thing here is how do we ensure that as we look to scale up carbon dioxide removal, this does not come at the cost of rapid emissions reductions. And there's a couple of different elements under the Paris Agreement to keep an eye on here. One of those is the NDCs, the targets the governments have brought forward for 2030, and net zero targets and long-term strategies. A big challenge here is that there are few rules. They're often quite difficult to compare between NDCs, and the land sector in particular is often treated quite ambiguously. This is starting to improve. Governments are coming forward with more transparency in the NDCs, but it's a challenge to understand what we're looking for in the future. Another element in the Paris Agreement are the market mechanisms. At the moment, they're being negotiated as we speak, and key questions are whether we will have the rules in place to ensure environmental integrity, to avoid double counting, and then whether or not those market mechanisms will be fit for purpose for large-scale carbon dioxide removal. There's also a question for the voluntary carbon market, so that's not being determined here at COP26, but is also becoming kind of increasingly important. And a really big issue here is how do we deal with issues of permanence? So when you have credits of different quality, of different levels of permanence, how will you compare those kind of credits? I wanted to quickly point out some analysis that we've done as the Climate Action Tracker. We've taken a look at the net zero targets that a bunch of governments have brought forward, and we've come up with our own best practice for what we think a good, robust, clear, solid net zero target would include. You can see some examples in this figure here, and one of these elements is to provide really transparent information on the level of carbon dioxide removal that is part of the net zero target, and I think it's the third from the right in that diagram, and you can see many countries are currently not providing that information. Another is on providing separate targets for emissions reductions and removals, and again, not many governments have so far provided that within their net zero targets. And another really important element here is the credibility of these net zero targets can be called into question when the 2030 NDCs that are so far on the table are not actually aligned with getting those emissions down to net zero in the next couple of decades. So there are also scientific governance challenges, and I think Thelma gave a really nice introduction to some of those, and I won't there's far too many to go into, but just briefly more what's going on within the Paris Agreement system. One element is the greenhouse gas inventories that governments put forward and the tracking that they do against their NDCs and their commitments. And there are a lot of gaps and uncertainties, partly because of capacity challenges in countries that have struggled to track what's happening in the land sector. In particular, uncertainties are very high when trying to understand emissions and removals in the land sector. There are also challenges with carbon removal technologies that have supply chains that cross international borders. So for example, if you were to have bioenergy feedstocks that were transported across a border and ultimately combusted and the carbon stored in a different country, how do we track that? And of course, a really important issue here is how do we develop portfolios of carbon dioxide removal that are sustainable, that can have co-benefits at the local, regional, national level for sustainable development, and that prevent adverse impacts on, for example, local communities, local biodiversity. And so all of this means that we're currently in a situation where it's quite difficult to track where we're going. Ideally, we would be in that top equation, 3 apples makes 3 apples, but I think the second equation is a little bit more representative of where we are right now with removals of different quality. We're still trying to understand what different types of removal mean, still trying to understand what targets governments have put forward mean for the future. And so, yeah, we really need to improve our ability to track progress, especially with all eyes on net zero. How will we actually know when we get there, and how will we know that we're doing so in a way that's compatible with the Paris Agreement and with sustainable development? A last quick slide on who is responsible. So this is something that we've been looking into from an equity perspective. I think this is a really important issue both across geographies, so which countries hold more responsibility for carbon dioxide removal, but also across generations. So this is really a question of intergenerational equity. And one of the bits of research that we looked at showed that for every additional gigaton of emissions that we release in 2030, this leads to tens of gigatons more carbon removal needed over the century, at the end of the century, for future generations to pick up in some of the major emitters. So real questions here on who should be deploying carbon removal, who should pay, and we're going to need to look for some kind of inventive mechanisms to incentivize carbon dioxide removal and make sure those who are doing it get the right resources. So that's just a quick summary slide of what I've been saying. So we need more ambitious NDCs. We need to consider sustainable development, of course. We need to improve our information and accounting systems in order to understand where we're heading for net zero. And we also need to take issues of equity into account and climate justice, and to develop incentives that really work for carbon dioxide removal without jeopardizing sustainability. And with that, there's a few publications up there for you to take a look at if you're interested in more. Thank you for your attention. I'll now pass over to James.
Thank you, Claire. As the fact that you handed me the remote suggests, it's good that we're sitting in the studio together and both have the advantage of technical clarity. I'll pick up largely from where you left off. We've heard the scientific picture, and it's complex, but it points in the direction of carbon dioxide removals being important. And you've talked about some of the governance challenges and some of the issues that will need to be resolved in order for us to tap this potential. What I wanted to talk about was why we should undertake this and come at it from a slightly different perspective. And that's the perspective of economic growth and the fact that in this instance, climate justice and climate action actually push in the same direction. So I'll focus on Africa in particular. And the African challenge is a substantial one because there is a demographic challenge. Africa needs to generate about 30 million new jobs every year to absorb the fact that it has the fastest growing population in the world. Without some disruptive transformations in its economic structure, it's hard to reach those numbers with business as usual. Unfortunately, the sectors just don't give us the opportunity to really get there. However, when you look at the potential, well, it's also complicated by the fact that adaptation, or the need for adaptation, is complicating people's ability to earn a decent livelihood. So not only are you adding new people into the workforce, but the very impacts of climate change are making it harder for them to support themselves in the ways that they have in the past. What some of the work that we've been doing is suggesting is that there's a realistic path to get there by leveraging some of this population and putting them to work on carbon dioxide removal type activities and other aspects of the climate action agenda. Keeping in mind also that without action, without committing Africa to a decarbonized growth path, both for its own consumption as well as producing for the world, then while Africa is a small emitter today, it will be a major player down the road just sheerly because of numbers, and will make the climate targets that we're looking at even harder to reach. And so looking at Africa purely from the lens of adaptation and support for adaptation, we think, or the data suggests, is a mistake. We need to be asking, what can Africa's role be in mitigation, both by avoiding the potential of future emissions, but then very importantly, really thinking seriously about what is the job creation potential of large-scale carbon dioxide removals. Claire, you talked about the question of who should pay for carbon dioxide removal and where it should be done. And I think part of the key here is separating those two things and saying where is the best place to do it, probably where it's most economically competitive to do so, who should pay, probably those who have done the most to emit to date. So what we have done is try and bridge a little bit some of the emerging science on carbon dioxide removal with some of the economic data and economic realities by country. And our finding is that removals opportunities in Africa present viable climate and livelihood opportunities at a meaningful scale. So the first thing we asked is, well, let's pick a number. And here I'm showing what would be possible, taking into account current land uses, current economic activity, current levels of skill across different countries, and of course natural endowments of different kinds, at about $50 per ton, what might be possible, right? And what you find is you're talking about 300 million tons of land-based carbon dioxide equivalent removal per year, distributed. So those are some of the countries that will be able to do the most about that. At that price, you'll be talking about transfers to Africa of about $15 billion a year. Again, this is not a ridiculous number. It's quite a manageable number. And the interesting thing is the jobs impact. Between 35 and 86 million jobs and livelihoods. Now, some of this is completely new livelihoods at a decent, dignified standard of living, and some of it is improvements to existing incomes. And the levers we're pulling are things like increasing the amount of tree cover on farmland, it is forest protection, it is some amount of reforestation, it is the deployment of biochar, and it is peatland restoration, among other things. If we look at the current scientific information on how labor intensive these are and how much carbon dioxide removal potential each of them have, you get a picture that says this on its own is not going to solve our carbon dioxide removal needs, but it's a decent chunk, and actually it does have a huge impact on livelihoods. Most importantly, you're taking a population that currently is sitting at the level saying just we need adaptation support, we need aid, and saying here's an economic activity that's contributing towards narrowing the gap, generates jobs, and puts you on the right track. Now, notably, $50 does seem high relative to today. Today we're talking about numbers closer to $10 a ton. But even there, if Africa were to focus on doing carbon dioxide removal at scale using some of these existing mechanisms, you end up with numbers that are not to be sneezed at. You end up with about $1 billion a year, which is very little cost, but is a lot higher than what's going in today, and about 5 million jobs and livelihoods impacted. So again, we can start now and begin to ramp up the skills and knowledge. And again, this is the initial analysis based on what we know now. There's a very decent chance that we could get even more efficient. At $120 per ton, you end up with about $80 billion per year needed, and about 680 million tons removed. In each of these cases, we're omitting the avoided emissions impact, because a lot of the carbon dioxide removal work happens at the same time and is the same work that would also contribute to avoided emissions from deforestation and degradation of lands. And that in most of the estimates I presented essentially doubles or more than doubles the actual emissions impact of the work. And so the critical takeaway here is starting to think seriously about carbon dioxide removals is an important way not only to think about how we achieve our 1.5 degree ambitions, but it is also critically a way to bring parts of the world that have not contributed as much in emissions to the current crisis into the mitigation discussion. And in the mitigation discussion, there's a chance to create economic opportunity and create dignified livelihoods at I think, economically rational and feasible levels. Notably, and there is a tendency to say, well, we're comfortable thinking about land-based and nature-based solutions in places like Africa. As we think about some of the engineered solutions that were also mentioned, things like DACs and BECCS, While very little of that is currently being piloted or even considered for Africa, its geographic, geological, ecological, and population dynamics, as well as access to ample renewable energy potential, suggests that Africa might very well be the leading location for some of those activities in the future, if they were to prove a viable alternative area. And so the point here is, for a continent that's looking for major new economic opportunity and livelihood generation areas, carbon dioxide removal does seem, certainly from the analysis and what the current analysis is showing, does seem to offer the potential to both achieve some degree of climate justice while driving towards meaningful climate action in line with the 1.5 degree target. And with that, I'll hand it over to back to you, Kerry.
Thanks very much. Thank you very much, Claire and James. I really enjoyed those presentations and the rounded view that you give on tackling climate change. We're going to move very swiftly on to our next speaker, Eva. And Eva, I'm going to try to share your slides from here.
And thank you, Kerry. I apologize for not being able to share it, but something must have happened here. But I can start talking when you, if that's okay, Kerry?
Yes, please.
Yes, and first, thank you for the invitation to talk about carbon dioxide capture and storage. And that's a little other view than some of the other presentation. And I've heard so much interesting on the CDR. But CCS, carbon capture and storage, is why is it important? This is the only technology that can reduce CO2 emissions from many important industrial processes, like cement, steel industries, and waste incineration. And CCS is a key part of achieving our climate goals. And with CCS, we are talking large-scale emission reduction. But during its years of development, CCS has faced questions about whether it is technical, feasible, and safe. So next, please. And just to give you the easy answer and the quick answer, yes, capturing CO2 and permanently storing it in deep geological formation is feasible and safe. The knowledge and the technology for this is ready. Offshore Norway, CO2 has been injected for 25 years deep under the seabed, and more than 26 million tons of CO2 has been permanently stored. The world's first offshore CO2 storage project was the Sleipner CCS project, started in 1996, and in 2008 CO2 was captured from the Snøhvit field up north in the Barents Sea. And the CO2 is stored nearly 3,000 meters under the seabed. These projects are supported by heavy monitoring programs that new projects can benefit from, and the data is shared with research communities and other stakeholders. But before we can store the CO2, it needs to be captured, and we need to be sure that we have effective and cost-effective technology. The Norwegian Technology Center Mongstad, the TCM, as you see on the right here, is the world's largest facility for testing and development of carbon capture technologies. This is open to companies and scientific communities around the world for testing their technology. So we have done it for 25 years, and we have testing different technologies since 2012. Next, please. So So with the aim to get an overview of where we can store CO2 offshore Norway and how much CO2 can be stored, we launched the Norwegian CO2 Storage Atlas in 2014. And the same year, the regulations for CO2 transport and storage were published as an implementation of the EU's CCS directive. So in the North Sea, what we see is in the North Sea Basin, the greatest potential capacity for permanent storage of CO2 will be in deep saline geological formations or in depleted oil and gas fields, injecting the CO2 down from 800 and down to around 3,000 meters under the seabed, and with up to hundreds of meters thick impermeable caprock sealing the CO2 in the reservoirs, where it can be trapped for millions of years. So as you see from the slide, the storage sites for CO2 are available with large capacity. We expect to have estimated capacity of around 80 gigatons, so it's no problem with the capacity. So the next one. So what can be the challenge for CCS carbon capture and storage deployment? I have borrowed this figure from IOGP, which provides an overview of ongoing CCS projects in Europe. 66 projects are identified, but only 4 in operation, and I have already mentioned 2 of them, the Sleipner and Snøhvit. So what can we do with that? We see that the North Sea Basin appears to be a key area for the development of CCS in Europe. And why is that? Through more than 50 years of petroleum activity, the geology in the North Sea Basin is well known. And it's here where the reservoir rock suitable for storing CO2 can be found. And there's a lot of the total capacity in this area. So what more is needed? I think we must admit, as has been talked by others here, it is about cost and policy. We have the technology, but cost and policy is an important part. And we can add a U into the letters as CCUS, and by that give it a commodity aspect that can contribute to add value to help realize a project economy. So next one. Identifying these challenges, cost, technology is there, but cost and how to really develop the full chain. So identifying this, the Norwegian government launched the Longship full-scale demonstration project. Longship includes capturing CO2, as you see, from industrial sources in the eastern part of Norway, from cement and from waste to energy, and shipping by ship, sailing the CO2 to an onshore terminal to the western part of Norway. From there, CO2 will be transported by pipeline to an offshore storage location, subsea in the North Sea, for permanent storage. And the aim of this project, as I said, is to contribute to developing the more cost-effective technology for the whole value chain, develop a full-scale CCS value chain in Norway by 2024, and demonstrate that CO2 management are safe and possible. So this project is about learning, it's about cost reduction, and it's about business development. And this infrastructure like this would be an open infrastructure for cross-border transport of CO2. And CCS here can also enable negative emission as part of large-scale deployment. And I think that's something that sometimes is forgotten. So the next, please. So following the government's decision on the Longship project, we began to see an increased interest in developing CCS value chains, both in Norway, but also other places in Europe. So the next phase here is to start creating a sustainable future for CCS. 2 new areas for permanent CO2 storage is announced offshore Norway with an application deadline of December 9 this year. One up in the Barents Sea, the left slide, and one in the North Sea. And we know we have a lot solid regulation to follow up these projects. And we look really forward to seeing how big the interest for these areas will be. So this is out for companies to apply for it. The next, please. So to develop a sustainable CCUS value chain and demonstrate safe storage, we have the experience, we have the knowledge, we have a huge storage potential, we have the instruments. It's ready now. CCS is a key part of meeting our climate targets by decarbonizing the industry. It can enable negative emissions, and the technology is ready now. So just start. Thank you for the attention.
Thank you very much, Eva. That was a wonderful presentation sharing the potential for CCS and how it can help us meet our climate targets. I would like to remind the audience to please raise your hands to ask questions, because we will have a short question and answer session after this. And I would like to invite Alex Millwood to take the microphone. So Alex is Director of CCUS at the UK Department for Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy. Alex, the floor is yours.
Hello everyone, I'll just test microphone and feedback. Is that coming through clearly? Yeah, I'm getting a thumbs up, that's good. Yeah, it's fantastic to be participating with, a lot of people have been active in this area for a lot longer than the UK has, hearing what the IPCC's done and 25 years of experience in Norway, who delighted to say we work very closely with. And the UK has taken a lot of that learning from around the world and again is confident that the technology will work and will decarbonize. The context in which the UK thinks of carbon dioxide removal and CCUS in particular is within the recently launched UK net zero strategy, which anyone who's been participating in COP with the UK hosting it will certainly have heard about that. But that it really does set out how the UK will get to net zero by 2050 across all of the different attributes, particularly starting in the right priority with reducing the production of CO2 in the first place, driving down efficiency, and only lastly, where there's some what's called the hard to abate areas of CO2 will then start to be activated. So renewables and solar is a higher priority than removal because it doesn't produce carbon in the first place. Nature-based solutions is a higher priority. But when we look at all of the maths, notwithstanding Claire's points about flaws in the governance and the measurements and NDC, then all of that does sum up to a net zero. So what does that then translate down into CCUS's contribution to net zero? Well, currently, the world stores about 40 megatons of CO2 per annum. And a lot of that in Norway that we heard, and the US has done a significant amount of CO2 removal. The UK, by the end of 2030, has an ambition to store safely and permanently under the seabed, very similar to Norway, at 20 to 30 megatons per annum. When the UK's equivalent of the IPCC that we heard from Telma, we have the Committee for Climate Change, worked out its estimate to get to net zero, it saw a contribution required of that sort of order of magnitude of 20 to 30 megatons per annum by 2030, you know, this critical decade that we've all been hearing about. Within that, the engineered greenhouse gas removal, things like direct air capture, things like bioenergy carbon capture, BECCS, and others, will contribute about 6 megatons per annum. And just like James has been talking, you know, the economic benefit, we do anticipate this new industry will, a number of economic benefits actually. The industries that we heard about, the cement, the steel, you know, those are people working in companies that want to be in a net zero company. All the people I talk to want to be part of that, and they see how difficult it is. So they see carbon capture as getting their companies to net zero and protecting their jobs. And the UK estimates we can create an additional 50,000 jobs per annum as part of this program as well. And you know, so therefore there is a significant benefit in doing so. You know, I think the way that the UK is doing it is establishing business models and working through clusters. So the UK in its industrial history had a number of industrial regions they've got together, and to work out the most cost-effective method is to coordinate themselves into what we call clusters. They're closely located industries, and through a pipeline will capture the carbon and connect it to an offshore location, just like Norway. You know, Norway's program will be using shipping. You know, we intend to get to that later. And again, as we heard, the North Sea has a large amount of storage. So we'll then start to bring shipping CO2 to bring in CO2 from other countries and help them decarbonise, as well as sort of remote parts of the UK that are not so close in. And then so we've got a number of different business models. I think the way we've done it is unique currently, between how we intend to effectively help industries offset the additional cost of the CO2 capture and removal, as well as incentivise companies to provide that storage utility and facility. So I'll pause there because I know, Kerry, you want to get into some questions and answers and leave some information there. You know, the good thing about governments is they publish an awful lot of information. The UK has published its net zero strategy, which lists it all out. All of the current work on the business models, the economic stimulation that the UK is working towards is all published on the UK Gov websites. So if anyone wants to know more, there is a wealth of information that people can access and learn how to take that into Africa, into other parts of the world as well. And you know, the UK is delighted to be able to share that knowledge and help other countries decarbonise in that way as well. I'll pause there, Kerry, give you some time to do some Q&A.
Thanks very much, Alex, and thank you for your efficient presentation on CCUS in the UK. We put this event together because we wanted to talk about the rapid and transformative action needed to reduce emissions and tackle climate change. And we saw that while awareness of the global climate emergency is growing, there's still a gap between the NDCs and what we need to achieve in order to reach the goals of the Paris Agreement. We saw that we needed effective governance to achieve the Paris Agreement goals and deliver the Sustainable Development Goals to minimise the climate risks and ensure a sustainable future. So large-scale carbon dioxide removal has got a key role to play, as does CO2 storage. So based on the science assessed by the IPCC, to reach the 1.5 degree target, we are going to need to store an awful lot of carbon dioxide, and we're even going to need negative emissions in order to reach our targets. So looking at the governance, how we enable this safely, how we enable this moving everybody forward together to a more sustainable future is really critical. And it's great to have such an excellent panel of speakers here today talking to us with so many different perspectives on how we can move to net zero, and we can do so all together. So I would ask any of the participants to please raise their hands if they have questions. And I'd like to say Kai Uwe, who is very happy to be in the studio, I'm sure, would be happy to help moderate the question and answer session. So if you have any questions, please raise your hand and the technical group will give you the microphone.
Great. I have, thanks for the support from UNFCCC. So I have here Matthias Honegger, if you have a question, if you might please raise it.
Yes, thank you very much. I hope you can hear me all right. Recalling what Thelma said in terms of having, a need for further clarity on a number of terminologies. I always find CCU and CCUS to be a very tricky terminology, and the question therein is really, what is the requisite durability of the storage for something to result in a removal or just in durable storage as requisite for the term CCS. And perhaps my question would go also to Alex Millward in terms of how the UK is addressing that question of permanence and of durability, given that, the different approaches, especially CCU approaches, come with very different timescales of, having the carbon actually bound outside of the atmosphere. Thank you.
Happy to provide that. So for the storage component, when we're talking permanently, we're talking in geological terms, which is, thousands and millions of years. An awful lot of certainly the gas, the natural gas that we use to heat our homes and energize our electricity systems came out of similar geological stores that stored there for millennia and millions of years. So, and I think as we heard, that is safe to do so permanently. On the usage side, I think there is still some innovation to go. There is some mixing with cement, for example, where you can capture it, mix it into the cement, put it into a building. Would a building last 200 years maybe before it crumbles and then that CO2 is released? And I think that is a shorter term bit. Personally, with the rate of technological innovation, I'd be very happy to buy a 200-year window to give us longer to solve this. So if we can create a value-add activity that makes cement stronger, cheaper, greener, then I think we can do that. By that time, carbon dioxide removal, direct air capture, I think will be more effective, more efficient. And if then the carbon's being released from a crumbling building, we can capture it there. Storing it into books from trees and storing it in a book for 100 years, is also another good route. There's toothpaste, there's clothing. There's an increasing range of innovation. Once we can get the cost of capture to be much lower, I'm sure we'll see the usual human ingenuity create a whole load of more temporary storage as well that I think would be very helpful for us all.
Thank you, Alex. I have also another person would be Timothy Dixon, if you can quickly introduce where you're from and pose your question. Thanks, Timothy.
Okay, thank you very much, Chair. I hope you can hear me okay. I'm in a very wet and windy Glasgow. I pity the protesters today outside. But thank you very much to all the presenters. Really excellent presentations, really interesting. And just to Claire, on the points you raised on the accountability of CDR, there's a very good report that's fed into what Alex referred to in the UK's net zero strategy. There is a GGR MRV report that addresses, well, it highlights the issues. It's not providing the solutions yet, but the UK government's taking those points very seriously. But my question is actually to Alex. With the UK clusters, Alex, what are the plans for knowledge sharing for those?
Yes, I've been...
Okay, Alex, if you could...
Yeah, can you hear me? I've been really impressed with a number of things. The public and private collaboration that's gone on to this common goal of achieving net zero, the international collaboration that's gone on. As we heard, Norway do a fantastic job of sharing that technical knowledge, and the governments share policy knowledge. So that's been happening. And then again, I think within private sector, they've done a fantastic job of sharing that as well. Obviously, there is some competitive tensions in there as well, and actually that's helpful from a taxpayer's perspective, because that competitive tension drives down cost, which is to everyone's advantage. But they've all sort of committed to innovation and sharing, and then as we know, the supply chains that help build the infrastructure will then go to other countries and take that knowledge and take it through, as well as other international companies are coming in and investing in the clusters, partly to get the knowledge to be able to take it back home as well. So I think there's a number of systemic things, including the gift of sharing, to a limit, recognizing there's intellectual property, there's a significant amount of research and development in here. But I've been really impressed at the intent to share to the common goal of net zero.
Thank you. I've been signaled that we have 60 seconds left, so I think we have also no question left. I think I will probably have even no time to say many concluding remarks, I think, but the one remark I think we have all also seen here is that there's a lot still to be shared, defined, learned about how we can drive and scale up CDR with many dimensions of challenges which are still ahead. But we have also, explorers like the UK or in Africa, Adam, in terms of trying to find new drivers and new approaches to actually tackle and address these, or integrate this into economic development. I'm sure I don't make justice to everything we heard. Very good experience of 25 years in storing in geological spaces, and work by Climate Analytics on actually identifying political and other governance issues. We mentioned one thing about something lasts 200 years, but who is then responsible in 200 years to deal with the fact that something is emerging back into the atmosphere? Just as one of these examples of challenges around permanence, as we talked about this. But I don't do justice in any form, I think, in any of that, the complexity or the beautiful challenges these things might encounter, as long as we tackle them and we tackle them fastly, and primarily emission reductions in this space. So I'm sure there will be forums created and emerging for policymakers, for technical people to deal with that. And I'm sure we're going to see each other in those spaces again. And thank you everyone for contributing, for living and making do with the technical challenges we have faced. Thanks for the UNFCCC team and the host country for making this happen, at least from our side. We know that's not an easy task to manage, and it worked for that quite well. I would maybe give Kerry, if you have one last remark or anything of that nature. Otherwise, I would just say thank you to everyone for being with us here.
I'd just like to thank all of our speakers for working through us with this slightly technically difficult session, and I'd like to thank everybody, and I'd like to thank C2G for organising this session alongside C2G Net. Thank you so much.